All right, welcome everyone. I still feel like I'm a relatively new face to this community. So if you did not have the chance to watch the recording from last month's Zeek Community Call, my name's Michelle Pathé. I started in April as the community liaison, and I thought I would kind of jump in and take the mic for our June community call. And I'm very excited to do so. So the agenda will be pretty similar to last month's. We will start with updates from Johanna, if she has any, and then we'll move on to some project news from Christian. And we've also invited Eldon Koyle here to share some additional project updates. And then from there, Fatima will share information regarding subgroups, and then I'll jump in towards the end with some community reminders. And if there is any Q&A or any questions that folks have, we'll kind of wait till the very end to get to those. So
Michelle,
yes.
just to add, and I think Benjamin has an update for us as well. So it's
Oh,
even more
great.
today. So yeah, cool.
Wonderful. So thank you, Christian. Johanna, do you mind kicking us off?
Oh, sure. I won't hold us up very long because there isn't that much. So in the last month, the main things that the LT discussed are actually projects of Michelle, which I have no idea if she's going to talk about more, but you might have noticed that there's a little bit of cleanup going on in some Slack channels that was discussed, and a potential upcoming community survey was discussed. Apart from that, the LT spent a little bit of time talking about AI content on our platforms, because we were made aware that there have been cases in which people have posted answers to questions on our platforms that were very, very probably generated with AI. Which in itself might not be a problem. The problem was that the answers were completely and utterly wrong. And we wanted to point out that when you post answers to something in one of our platforms, especially if you create them with AI, make sure that what you're posting is not incorrect, because we want our platforms to have high quality content, and posting obviously incorrect things is not acceptable in essence. Apart from that, those were the main things. If you're interested in the work of the LT, I also want to point out that we post our meeting notes publicly on community.zeek.org into the LT meeting notes category. The last one was posted a couple of minutes ago.
Wonderful. Thanks, Johanna. All right. So project updates. Christian, do you mind jumping
Yeah,
in?
that sounds great. Cool. Yeah, I have a little bit more to show you guys today. Since 7.2 just came out a few weeks ago, so I have prepared some slides. This should probably take on the order of yeah, probably about sort of 10 minutes or so. So let me see here. All right. Holler if you can't see this or can't hear me. Okay, so yeah, like I said, so we introduced Zeek 7.2 and what was it, about 4 weeks ago? I think it was May 9th. And so I figured I'd talk about that in a little bit of detail just to give you some context on where that fits in with what we're doing right now. And so those who have sort of been around for a while have seen me probably present this a little bit. I'm going to give a sort of abridged version today of our release cadence, just for those of you who are sort of new, so you know how to place things. And so we always aim to release 3 main release trains a year. This is our .0 LTS, long-term support release train, a .1 and a .2. And the long-term support release train essentially gets updates across the year. So whenever we find security issues, bug fixes, and so forth that go into one of the current release trains, we make sure to backport that into the LTS train and crank out a new release. And so right now we are basically right there in the middle. So we have just released 7.2 and are now ramping up for 8.0 to come out in the summer. So this is sort of a pretty exciting time for us because it means that we sort of need to get the things in place that we want to have out there as part of our next long-term support release. And to give you a bit of an idea of what we're doing right now, it helps to place the work in context of everything that's sort of been happening since Zeek 6 and that we're hoping to essentially more or less wrap up by Zeek 8. And this is essentially an architectural revamp. So what is happening there is that many of you, I think, know Broker, which has been Zeek's messaging layer since the olden days, Bro 2.4 in 2015. And what Broker is basically a library that provides a pub/sub service that is sort of based around this notion of point-to-point peerings and is built upon a third-party library called the C++ actor framework. So it is important to stress that that is a library. It's not a service. It's not a thing that runs standalone. It's something that we basically just use as part of Zeek clusters being composed of, a set of processes, and Broker enables those things to talk to each other. And we started building this about a decade ago, really essentially because at that time, the lay of the land was very different. There wasn't much choice. We really only sort of considered 0MQ a little bit at that time, which was also in a very different place back then. And for various reasons, basically back then concluded that we're better off building our own. And then it's fair to say that it has served us well over the years, but we've also added a lot of stuff during that time, essentially because it often felt sort of like a good place to park things that weren't necessarily critical to Zeek itself. So examples that come to mind are things like, there's a JSON serialization format on top of Broker's own binary format. There are data stores, there's telemetry, there are WebSockets. So a bunch of things that sort of open Zeek up a little bit, that allow you to do things with it, really actually are built into Broker. And the not so good news is that we really have kept breaking and fixing it. And this is sort of a theme in our team. So every time we come up on a release, we sort of wonder if there's another Broker thing that we need to take care of sort of last minute. We've always managed that, so it's never really gone wrong or anything, but it is a headache. I think that's a reality to acknowledge. And so around Zeek 6, we basically started to wonder like how we could do this better. And so what we've been building since is essentially sort of a transition in the architecture. So if you look at Zeek 6 and how things worked, then you basically sort of have this pretty fat sort of Broker layer that provides a ton of functionality, essentially the stuff that I just sketched. So like a pub/sub service, serialization, deserialization, data stores, and telemetry. And Zeek essentially sort of mirrors that into Zeek itself by sitting directly on top of that. And where we're going now is a world where that is still a thing, but where the implementations of these things are basically choosable, selectable, pluggable. So if you look closely at where Broker is on the right-hand side, then you see that it is sort of much diminished, and it is essentially one of several other possible implementations for pub/sub, for serialization, deserialization, in particular, and not much else, because for everything else, there is now either functionality that you can run somehow differently via a different backend, or that simply exists in Zeek itself at this point. And so this is a little bigger than Broker itself. So what we're doing there is sort of the building blocks for sort of a different way of thinking of how Zeek can fit in your infrastructure, where we really would like for it to be more malleable to sort of your requirements in your existing surroundings. So Zeek as sort of a framework that blends into your existing architecture much better than it does right now. So it should be easy to run Zeek, right? So we will give you cluster and storage backends that suit your environment. If you run, 0MQ, that's great. If you want to use Redis, that's great. If you want to sort of converge a little bit on NATS.io, that's great too. And what we want to achieve by this is basically a more straightforward notion of pub/sub. So if you know Broker, then you know that it basically implies a physical that it establishes a physical topology over which we then run PubSub. That is sort of why you have to think about like, okay, so do I want to send events over from our workers to our proxies and then from proxies back to workers? It shouldn't be like that. You should just be able to say, I want to do a worker-wide broadcast. Sorry. It should be easier to choose how you run Zeek. So we would like to get to a place where you can basically say, Zeek control as is today works great for me, but it would be nice if we could just say, okay, and when you actually sort of launch that thing, make it more service-oriented, run it over systemd and so forth. Like there are lots and lots of other ways out there to run distributed architectures today that don't involve as much sort of homegrown stuff as we need in Zeek today. It is a little too hard to get into Zeek right now in our documentation. This is sort of a bit of a shift here. This is not the architecture, but this is really sort of about, you know, finding your way in Zeek as you arrive. And we've started to do a bunch of work there. We have a new quick start right now. I'm not sure many people have noticed that. We have just refreshed our FAQs, so that is interesting. Check those out. And up-leveling again a little bit, it should be easier to interact with Zeek. So lots of our power users basically run third-party services that need to exchange events with Zeek. So that is something that you can do right now, but it is a little clunky because the serialization format that we run over those WebSockets that we have for that purpose are, you know, that serialization format is arguably not as convenient as it should be for people who just, you know, want to send back and forth some events, essentially. It should be easy to extend Zeek because that's sort of the bread and butter of what we do in Zeek. And you know, the Zeek scripting language has been there since the beginning, but for several releases now we've offered JavaScript, so like a much more, you know, well-known, familiar language to many users that we're hoping will see increased adoption in our platform. So what I'm trying to frame here is that we're doing all this broker work, but there's really sort of something a little bigger going on in that we want to make it much more seamless and easy for people to run Zeek in modern settings. And what we're doing here is essentially just sort of the starting point for that work. So I hope this helps a little bit to give you guys context. And so where does Zeek 7.2 fit in that picture? So we're pretty happy with how 7.2 landed. So the first biggie that arrived is the storage framework. We had initially hoped to maybe get that into 7.1, and we decided to basically hold off until 7.2 because it, you know, just needed a little longer to mature. So what is the storage framework? It is a key-val store, or, you know, it can offer you multiple stores for script layer data. So there are APIs that you can use from the script layer to say, open a data store, put some data in there, get it out, close it, and it allows you to do that either synchronously or asynchronously as you choose. So for example, you can, you know, open a data store synchronously in your Zeek init calls, set up some content, make sure that it is there, verify it, whatever you need, sort of, and then at runtime switch to asynchronous calls so that you're not held up by, you know, a backend that you know, might take some time to execute those operations. As usual for Zeek, there is a lot of pluggability. So both the backend technology of a data store itself and the serialization format that we use to store data in it are pluggable. So on the serialization front, we currently just use JSON. And in terms of backend implementations, 7.2 ships with 2. Those are SQLite because of, you know, basically familiarity. This is essentially what people are often used to from the broker days. And Redis because it is a more modern centralized data store. And we have a Zeek package that offers a prototypical NATS.io package that is, or backend, sorry, that allows you to use this as well. So the idea here is basically that instead of building a lot of functionality into Zeek that you need in order to sort of wrangle your data stores, you can really sort of offload a lot of functionality via the right choice of backend implementation. So for example, if you just want some node local persistence, SQLite sounds really good. Like you can just, like in every, you know, node in your Zeek cluster, open an SQLite store, store data in it, and when that node comes back up, that store, that state will still be there. If you want sort of something cluster-wide, centralized state, then it makes total sense to run a centralized service because that will naturally, you know, provide the same content that you put in there from one node to another node. So there is no need for us in Zeek to build something that propagates the state via eventing or even sort of custom message types if the store itself takes care of that for us. It's sort of a win-win. You get to use sort of proven modern technology for this, and we have to build less in Zeek to make that happen. Data import export is another sort of potential application, because you can think of these data stores sort of as bridges to other tooling, other infrastructure that exists in your environment that already sort of populates stores. Like, we're just sort of, using those as well. So that's another thing you can do. A couple of sort of caveats. So 7.2 itself doesn't yet use the framework. We've just sort of put it in there. But we started the transition. So Tim has basically been tinkering with a migration of the data stores that are in Zeek's own policy scripts, and we're running those on Redis right now, and it's looking really good. And we're basically planning to switch that over the course of the next few releases. And the whole thing you should sort of picture as a starting point, because there's definitely stuff that comes to mind if you want to sort of lean heavily on them that isn't yet there. So for example, if you picture you build a distributed counter, then you need some sort of locking to make sure that the get and set operation sort of is yours while you bump up that counter, because even though some backend might implement functionality for that is not necessarily exposed by that backend as we implement it in this framework. So there's functionality sort of that we're sort of exploring and tinkering with, and I think this is pretty exciting stuff, but it is fairly new. We are looking for feedback, so please kick the tires on this if this is a space that is of interest to you. And keep in mind that Broker's own data stores are there for now, but we will probably in the very near future deprecate them. And so this should be the thing you consider as the way forward for your storage needs in Zeek. The cluster backend work that we started in the 7 cycle has matured further. So in 7.2, we essentially for the first time shipped with 0 MQ support out of the box. Meaning the default is still Broker, but it is very easy to switch over to 0 MQ at this point. If you check out our documentation, it's essentially a one-liner, and we've made it pretty easy for you to try this out. So if you try our binary packages, 0 MQ support is in there. It's really, it's pretty easy to do. We are doing this ourselves at this point. We still find issues, but it's essentially runnable. It was technically in 7.2, but at that point we were still, definitely hesitant to sort of almost even talk about it. But at this point, we're pretty excited to sort of, open it up to the world. If everything goes well, we will switch over to 0 MQ as the default backend in 8.1. So we'll see. We're pretty sort of bullish on this right now. It's looking pretty good. And since the cluster backend technology is also pluggable, we want to make sure that we're not missing anything by basically sort of having 0 MQ blinders on. So we also have a experimental NATS.io package that was really more of a sort of prototype, essentially to demonstrate that if you just ship a different cluster backend as a Zeek package, that actually works. So we don't really consider ourselves like NATS experts by any means. 0 MQ also has this big advantage that you can run it without needing to run a standalone service. So the way we've built it is that you essentially fork off 0 MQ threads from the manager node that then essentially acts as a broker. But you can, because this is really flexible stuff, sort of, you can run your own 0 MQ based broker as a separate process if you want. It essentially just needs 2 ports, like one to pump stuff in and one to read from, and that is it. But we like this because basically one of the big benefits of Broker has always been that you don't need a standalone service, that you can just say like start up Zeek and there it goes. And with 0 MQ, we're able to preserve that. So that's actually really quite nice. We've also shifted the WebSocket stack. So the WebSocket stack was a great addition in Broker, but if we're making Broker an optional thing, then we need to preserve that. And the best way to preserve that is basically by moving that functionality over into Zeek itself. This looks pretty seamless. So essentially, if you're using that in your current applications, then you just need to switch over from saying broker listen WebSocket to cluster listen WebSocket, and you've basically switched out the implementations. A nice sort of detail about the new stack is that it's unencrypted by default. I think this is a win because for most, sort of ramp ups when you're sort of new to this, you want to just sort of start tinkering with a WebSocket client on the command line or some such. And that being unencrypted by default is, I think, much, much easier than when you have this, default encrypted but unvalidated setup that we use in Broker everywhere by default to get started. And the other biggie just to keep in mind is like, so all of broker stuff in that space remains available for now. We're just sort of moving things over sort of bit by bit. I don't want to ding broker too much. Broker itself has gotten much better too. So in 7.1, we, for the first time, introduced essentially explicit handling of back pressure in its peerings. So what this means is that this is essentially awareness of how well a receiver of messages is keeping up with the sender. And because of broker's peering-based nature, this basically means point-to-point connections. So there is, as of 7.1, awareness for each of those peerings, how well the receiving side can keep up. And in 7.1, we basically started this off by defaulting to a behavior where essentially the moment, this back pressure became too significant, so where basically a predefined maximum size of messages gets exceeded, we just kicked out the peering. We basically said there is something really wrong here. It's probably best for you to just sort of like take a break and start over, and then basically sort of come back once the peering has essentially recovered, restored, whatever you want to call it. That worked fine, but is pretty invasive. And we, from the get-go, had two other policies in there for how you could react to these overflows. And they were basically called drop oldest and drop newest. And if you think of this as a buffer, it really just means that when a new message shows up and the buffer is full, then you either kick out the oldest message that is already in there or the newest, the most recent arrival. And what we've switched to in 7.2 is essentially drop oldest. So you can now think of this as a buffer that if it is full and a new message shows up, it just kicks out the oldest, places the newest in the buffer, and continues. We've also cranked up the buffer size. The first version, I think, used 2048, which was basically more or less a number that we just came up with because we didn't have a lot of experience with this. And so since now we've had sort of a bit more time to bake this, we've sort of cranked this up, and we've reduced the retries that basically come up as you get this cluster going pretty drastically across the board. So they were in various places in the cluster framework, in broker, and they're now 1 second across the board. And in every single test setting that we considered, looking at cluster startup and trouble that you hit when you induce essentially sort of slowness is just much smoother. You can track this better now via metrics that we've also added. So you can basically see whether your buffers are keeping up, if they are overflowing, on which peering this happened, and essentially how many times. So this should really, if you look into your broker log and cluster log, essentially be pretty visible, particularly if you're stressing your clusters hard. And one example that we obviously immediately noticed when we sort of explored it a little closer was our test setup here at Berkeley Lab, where there is a lot of message exchange going on at startup. And it triggered essentially sort of this worst case scenario where there were so many messages being exchanged right at cluster startup that we immediately ran into these depeerings, repeerings in the 7.1 setup. So that wasn't super nice. And with 7.2, this is like butter. Like we're pretty pleased. This looks really nice. Is much faster too. Like the startup at this point is seconds, as it should be, and not, I think it was something like on the order of half a minute until everything was sort of really sort of ready to get going. So yeah, if you currently use broker, which is pretty much a given, there's nothing you need to do, but hopefully if you check out the logs, you might notice that things are running much sort of calmer, much smoother, particularly if you're currently running 7.1. So maybe take a look, and if you notice anything there, just let us know. We've improved the analyzer framework in 7.2. So this is relatively subtle. You won't notice that in too many places. The biggie is probably that in the conlog services field, you now have determinism in how we list protocols in there. This was previously essentially implementation dependent, and it is now happening in protocol confirmation order, which is usually also the protocol stacking order. So this is just much more intuitive to look at. For example, if you see something like, I don't know, like WebSockets going over HTTP or, like some such. And we've changed some of the details around analyzer violations and when we give up on a protocol for a given connection. This was previously and has been for a while more or less hardwired to a pretty arbitrary default of 5. So you needed that many violations before we gave up on a connection. And we've simply stripped that down to 1, which is essentially more intuitive and also mirrors how we confirm an analyzer, because basically like we get going on analysis of a given protocol the moment it gets confirmed. So why would we wait longer there? Why would we wait longer to give up on it too, right? It's just sort of a little bit more straightforward. Check the release notes for details on this. There are a couple more tuning knobs that you can adjust for this if you want the old behavior back, if you want additional detail, and so forth. Right. Zeek 7.2 ships with Spicy 113. I don't want to steal Benjamin's thunder, so I'm not going to say anything else about that because that's coming up. I'm nearly done, so just a quick look ahead to Zeek 8. There are a couple of biggies here that we're pretty excited about. So for Zeek 8, we're tackling pluggable connection tuples. So this notion of, what is currently always a 5-tuple of IP pairs, port pairs, and a protocol becomes extensible. So that's really powerful for settings where you want to have additional control about, whether or not you want to factor in VLAN tags or Geneva information and so forth. This is actually, we were sort of chuckling. This is one of the oldest tickets that we've had sit around, and we've always sort of kicked that down the road a little bit. And at this point, we found the time is right. So we'll put that in. There's a PR in flight right now with much iteration. So hopefully this can land pretty soon. We'll expand the storage framework use. I sketched that earlier. We have additional cluster backend work, just because that is a huge chunk of work that is sort of converging, but there is more to do. We'll have new analyzers. 7.2 did not ship with new analyzers, while 7.1 did. Redis just landed. We're eyeing a little more. We'll see how these are going. Nats, for example. But yeah, there's freshness sort of in that space as well. We have revamped analyzer.log and dpd.log. We consider these sort of, power user scenarios, I'll say. But essentially those were, the difference between those two was pretty subtle. And we've basically standardized on an analyzer.log that works a little bit differently now, but is hopefully a little bit more intuitive and consistent. I mentioned the docs sort of refresh earlier. We've basically, in no small part, thanks to Evan arriving, in the project with a new fresh of eyes, sort of realized that that structure is really comprehensive, I'll say. There's a lot of information in there, but to get started in the project, it's probably not ideal. And we haven't looked at the documentation from that angle in a long time. So we're going in there right now and basically sort of seeing what else we can do there to basically make it clear what it means to run Zeek, how you can do so, what you should keep in mind simply to invoke Zeek, like all of the basics, and only then focus on the scripting language, the frameworks, and so forth. If that leaves some time, and I frankly don't know how much it'll leave, we're aiming to do a ticket cleanup push because the number of open issues is a little higher right now than we would like. So we'll see how well we do there. And if you want to track that with us, there is a planning board that I'll link in the slides here and that you can just see on GitHub for the 8.0 release, where you see what we currently have slated and how that's going. And just in terms of timeline, so we're planning the branch of the release, or the forking of the release branch, and then subsequently RC1 on August 4th. And usually we release around 2 weeks later, sort of when our testing subgroup had a chance to sort of test that release. So fingers crossed, we should have that release sort of by mid-August. So that's sort of what I'm going to cover today. There's more in the release notes as usual, and as usual, a big shout out to our contributors. We've definitely gotten in the habit of calling them out. So folks, here you are. I hope I didn't overlook anybody. I hope we didn't overlook anybody. This is also what we have in the release notes. We couldn't do this without you. So thank you very much. And also, as usual, thank you to Corelight for the support. And that is it from me. So let me stop sharing. And I didn't look at the clock at all. I hope it wasn't super far off from 10 minutes. It was totally off from 10 minutes. I apologize, Michelle. That was terrible.
That is quite all right. Very thorough. Appreciate it, Christian. I know you mentioned that Benjamin's here to share some information about Spicy. I also want to be cognizant of Eldon's time. Eldon, do you mind if Benjamin takes a couple of minutes to share his updates and then we can move on to...
That's fine.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right, Benjamin.
Cool. So I don't have slides, so this will be probably faster. We'll see. Right. So we have Spicy. So we release Spicy independently of Zeek, but we kind of like track Zeek because we want to have the same support policy. So we like with Zeek 7.2, we came out with Spicy 1.13. And we have our own release notes. So if you look in the Spicy repo or in the releases, you find some high-level news file, like for Zeek, that like captures some story. So I'm not repeating all of this. I'm just giving you some preview for some things. And we did a whole bunch of things. And there's no big story, but things become nicer and more stable. And we got rid of bugs. That's the kind of story. If you want to track low-level changes, there's the changes file that has all the changes, right? So if you really want to drill down and see which ticket went in and what changes happened, this is in a lot of detail. So one thing we did, which is like pretty small actually in terms of implementation, but people might be happy about this, is UTF-16 support. So let's say you have a text like this, so this is a UTF-8 file. You see down here, this is UTF-8, and then with some Python, you can convert that to little endian UTF-16 with some bomb or not. I don't know exactly what Python does. And that looks like this. So this is UTF-16 little endian. And then I could have a parser that parses that and extracts the bytes, these bytes I just showed you, and then converts the bytes, decodes the bytes as a UTF. So all strings in Spicy are UTF-8. So you can convert that UTF-16 byte payload into a UTF-8 string with that new char set now. And that looks, this is the demo part, right? So this works. I tried this before. So I'm running Spicy dump. So this will just show you what this parser passed. I'm telling it to take the text, the input from that UTF-16 file I just showed you and use this grammar, right? Woo, it works, right? So you can like rip out your C++ code if you have C++ code for UTF-16 decoding. Another interesting feature is that we have like regex types in Spicy that you can use as part of your grammar, for example, to capture certain parts. And we now do case insensitive matching. So this one here, oops. If I run this, so this is, all right. So I have like a regex get here, which is uppercase. And if I search inside this byte payload, I find no match, right? Because this is lowercase. But if I had that small I here, I can match this weird capitalization, for example. And that's useful, I don't know, if you want to parse like HTTP, for example. Not all the verbs are standardized in case, right? So that's supported now. Another big thing we did, which is useful for mostly for external users that use reflection to reflect on Spicy parse results, is a notion of capturing type information on the language level, basically. So we already had type information, but you had no access to that from Spicy script code. So here, what do I do here? So here I create like variables that hold type information, right? So this here would be holding type information about bool, or this would hold type information about the type of that thing, which is a real, right? And we can also do that for user-defined types, right? So there's like some user-defined type S here, can capture that, and more demo. Let's call it type. Right, you see some types there, and this, like, if you don't use external bindings, the way you might use this is if you just like lose track of what's the type of your thing actually after converting and doing all kinds of massaging to your input data, you can just print that out down by calling this type info function and printing the result. And the other thing you might have seen is that we did a lot of cleanup around validation. So one area was around functions, for example, which would have previously failed in C++ land. So that stuff you hopefully don't see. And the other thing you might see is that we now more rigorously reject invalid attributes. So here you see something. So this is parsing a vector of uint8s of undetermined size. And then I attach some attribute here. So with spicy 112, this would have passed and would have done nothing, right? So if you wrote some attribute and intended it to do something, but that was wrong, we would have ignored that. And now we will just reject that. Right, so there's no attribute originator for field, right? So that's the kind of things you should see. And for more stuff, look at the news files, look at the changes, let us know if something breaks, or let us know if you have some clever idea for other things we could do. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Benjamin. All right, I know we're a little bit over time, but I feel like we might as well see the rest of the agenda through. So I'm going to invite Eldon up to share a couple of features for the group.
All right, so this is just like 2 features that are at least exciting to me. I don't know if some of them are already in. We usually stick to the LTS versions, so I won't actually see these until Zeek 8. But the handling of unknown protocols. So previously in the con log, we tracked TCP, UDP, and ICMP, and that's it for IP protocols. And then like if it's a tunneling protocol and the inside traffic is one of those, that traffic would be tracked as well. But there are a lot of other protocols that I'm interested in just knowing that they exist, even if we can't understand what the protocol is, just knowing that they're there, like IPsec. I mean, you can see, you know, the management of the IPsec tunnel, but you can't see the actual data that's going by inside the tunnel exists in Zeek logs. OSPF, like if something is talking OSPF on my network, I'd kind of like to know. IGMP, it's, you know, just there, but there are a lot of other IP protocols that weren't considered. And just knowing that the traffic is there was a little bit difficult with previous versions. So Tim made a change where basically we added a new field to the con log, and we're tracking now that numeric protocol, and those should be tracked by default. So those things should start showing up in the con log. And then they added some scripts, or he added some scripts to allow us to make it behave the way it used to for people who want that. And then, so I needed basically some TLV data from a Geneve header. And that turned out to be a more difficult thing to get a hold of than I expected. Like, it sounds like an easy problem, but it seemed like to get that data to scriptland, most of the things without editing code somewhere in Zeek required events to do that, and that's a little bit problematic because there's some overhead there, and so I had the opportunity to meet with Arna in person, and he created a PR that will basically let us track the data in the analyzer stack, and then added a BIF to get a hold of that from Scriptland. Is this the same thing that, or did this lead to the pluggable connection tuples? Is that kind of a similar thing?
In a way, yes. We had other drivers for it, but it certainly relates. Yeah.
But it's a similar
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the two options I guess I had that I wanted to highlight.
Great. Thanks so much, Sheldon. Really appreciate it. Fatima, do you have any updates regarding subgroups?
Not much, just a quick reminder to the community that we will have our Zeek full day training on October 20th till 23rd. We haven't decided on the day yet, but it will be conducted under the NSF Cybersecurity Summit, which is going to happen in Boulder, Colorado this year. So the dates are October 20th to 23rd in Boulder, Colorado. So that's a quick reminder. Thanks,
Awesome.
Michelle.
Yeah, we'll be sure to plug those dates throughout the summer so people can keep that in mind, keep it on the calendar. All right, before we wrap up, two quick community reminders. Johanna mentioned them at the top of the call, but for my neck of the woods, reminder that we are going to be doing our Slack cleanup on Friday afternoon. Really just archiving channels that have not been used in a while, consolidating some channels, and over the entire workspace, really just giving some updates to the descriptions and the topics, and really hoping to just make the Slack workspace much more organized and easier for people to use. So it'll happen on Friday afternoon, hopefully not disruptive to too many people. And things will be looking good to get back to business on Monday morning. And then also later this month, we're going to be launching a community survey that will take less than 10 minutes to complete. And really just, it's our team wanting to hear more from the community, who you are, how you use Zeek, how we can make the entire Zeek experience better and more useful to you. Completing that survey will be incredibly helpful to our team as we kind of look to the fall and early next year in thinking about how to really engage and connect with everyone in a meaningful way. So you'll be hearing a lot from me about that survey. I promise it won't take too long. I know surveys can be a little exhausting and tedious, but I think we tried to make it as easy as possible for y'all. So more on that to come. And those are the only two updates I had. Anyone have any questions or thoughts or last minute ideas that popped into their head before we wrap up?
Check out our blogs, people, because Evan wrote a really nice comparison of spicy versus bin pack, and we haven't really mentioned that yet. So do check it out and let us know what you think.
Definitely going to be putting that in tomorrow's newsletter that's going out. And I'll also be sure to include this recording in that newsletter as well. So, all right, everybody, thanks so much for the time. And I hope you all have a great rest of the week. We'll see you around. Take care, everybody.